now for some political analysis with our panel. Mark Landler covers the White House for the New York Times. Leslie Sanchez is a CBS News political contributor. Seung Kim covers the White House from Capitol Hill for the Washington Post. And Paula Reid is a CBS News correspondent. Great to have you all here. Always a lot to chew on, but Paula, we should have our own legal panel here because I feel like there's so much to digest from this week. Let's start with the president's tweets this morning. He is out there defending his son and saying that he has no concerns about him legally and this meeting that he took at Trump Tower with a lawyer linked to the Kremlin. Should he be concerned?
Yes, he should be concerned, even more so than he should be concerned for himself, because Donald Trump Jr. does have some legal exposure here. And the fact that he has not yet been interviewed by special counsel investigators, that should concern everyone, because typically in an investigation like this, you want to come in early. You want to be someone they're gathering evidence from, not the person who walks into the room and they have a pile of evidence and they start going through it. Now, his potential legal exposure, the first is for anyone who walks into the situation lying. But in a case like this, where there are all these different iterations of what happened in that Trump Tower meeting, that's a tremendous exposure for him. The possibility of perjury. He says he did not know, his father did not know about the Trump Tower meeting. Michael Cohen said he did. I think, legally speaking, it would be easy to discredit Cohen as a witness. And if Mueller thought there was something there, he likely would have handed that case off. But then the big question of the entire case is, was there any coordination or support or assistance with the Russians in terms of disseminating that dirt that they had?
Now, at the time, the first version of events given by the White House was that this was a meeting about adoptions, linking to an issue of concern for the Russian government. The president today says, no, it was about opposition research solely, and there's nothing illegal about that.
Exactly. The good news for them is there's no crime in lying to the press. But what they need to do is they need to figure out what exactly their story is, and it needs to be supported by the evidence. They need to make sure there's no witnesses or other evidence that would contradict that and expose them to lying when they sit down with investigators. But the special counsel does have questions for the president about why that statement was drafted, sort of misleading people about the reason for this meeting.
Mark, when we had Kellyanne Conway on the show, she was trying to explain that the president, when he uses this term Russian hoax, is referring to misunderstandings or misconstruing of facts related to the investigation, and that it has nothing to do with what his national security team says. You've been writing about the fact that they're saying two different things about the same topic, actually, which is the view on Russia, period.
Yeah, this is a recurring theme with the Trump White House, which is the efforts of his aides to sort of narrow the scope of what he's saying. When he talks about a Russian hoax, particularly in a tweet or in some of the inflammatory ways he does, he's really denigrating the entire effort to get at Russian interference in American elections and, frankly, to guard against interference in the midterm elections. And so I think that this week we saw this just amazing split screen where the administration arrayed all its top intelligence and law enforcement officials behind the podium at the White House, made this persuasive presentation about how seriously they take the threat and what they're going to do to try to fend it off. And then a day later, hours later, at a political rally, President Trump, in effect, dismisses the whole thing as much ado about nothing. For Kellyanne Conway to say, well, he's only narrowly talking about an investigation, no one in the American public is taking it that way. They're viewing it as what I think the president intends, which is to diminish the importance of the issue. And I think the reason he does that goes back to his own long-standing doubts about the legitimacy of his own election and his concern that if he gives this any credibility, it will reduce his own credibility. And so I think that this split screen is really what matters and not the after-the-fact attempts by the White House to spin it.
Is the effort here, to manage the public understanding of the Russia investigation, or is it to manage the president's own party? Because what you hear consistently from the Republican establishment is that they stand with the intelligence community and their version of events, not the characterization as a hoax.
I think it's a little bit of, it's multiple things. I think in terms of the public perception of Russia, and also we talk about how, along with the Mueller investigation, we talk often about how the president's constant tweeting and his attacks on Mueller is partially to just publicly discredit the investigation. So you do see that kind of...
With an eye towards what could happen
Exactly.
With a potential impeachment.
Exactly. And you saw the shock coming from Capitol Hill right after his comments in Helsinki alongside Vladimir Putin. But I think that whenever we ask congressional Republicans, look at the president's rhetoric, a lot of times they do point towards, well, look at what Dan Coates is saying, or what Secretary Nielsen is saying, or Director Reid. They're satisfied with what his administration officials are saying, but that is a different message coming from his top officials versus the president.
Leslie, I know you've been out there doing some reporting. Does all of this translate to people at home and people who are going to go place votes in November?
Big disconnect, right? So what the Republican Party is thinking is they want to buck traditional norms. They want the president not to have the major losses that most president would have at a midterm election, when these midterms tend to be a referendum on the president. They're saying, wait a minute, we have raised $250 million this election cycle. We have $50 million in the bank, meaning the Republican Party, and they're ready to marshal those resources on the ground. And they understand what the president understands, which is very much to this point, the pulse of the people. What used to be a roar in the Republican Party is now a whisper, because the economy is strong. The president is now at 50% approval, more or less. Congress is still at 10% approval, and they see that unemployment's low, and they can win. They may like the agenda, they may not like the man.
Paula, just to button up one part of the legal question this week, and that was
so many.
The former Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was in court last week. He will be headed back there. There was all this color about his personal wealth, his clothing. What is the prosecution trying to lay out here in terms of the picture?
Well, as the judge likes to continue to remind everyone, he is not on trial for having a lot of money and throwing it around. This trial has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the campaign. The allegation is that he made tens of millions of dollars from lobbying on behalf of Ukrainian politicians, but instead of having the check sent to one of his 6 houses, he had it put into offshore bank accounts. And then in order to allegedly get this money into the U.S., he laundered it through these luxury purchases. And that's where we get some of the color. The homes, the cars, the ostrich coat. Yes. And so that's their theory of the case. But it is important to remember, we did hear from some of his accountants late in the week, and there was evidence that some of this conduct, especially doctoring forms when he wanted to try to get some loans, some of that conduct did extend to his time in the Trump campaign.
Is there any connection to the president and what has happened so far?
So far, no connection to the president. Kellyanne Conway, she cited the judge, but let's be really clear what the judge has said about the special counsel investigation. During the preliminary hearings, the judge had questions about whether or not tax evasion or bank fraud, whether or not that was in the special counsel's authority. The judge came out and said, you're not interested in bank fraud. You're just trying to get this guy to cooperate in your investigation. Everyone sort of nodded and acknowledged this was a fact, and he allowed the case to proceed. But the president and his allies, they've seized on those comments to try to say the special counsel investigation is illegitimate, or a federal judge said they were out of bounds. But the judge has sort of nodded to exactly what's going on here.
Mark, do we have any idea, turning to the foreign policy front, what was in the letter from President Trump to Kim Jong-un that was handed off this weekend to North Korean officials?
We don't know the specifics of what's in that letter, but I think we have a fairly good idea, based on the president's own characterization of his recent interaction, that it was probably a very friendly letter thanking Kim for the letter he had sent, and probably setting the predicate for another meeting. There's a lot of talk about maybe doing it, pardon me, at the United Nations in September. But again, to go to this, it's a recurring theme with this administration, this notion of a dissonance or a split screen. You have this very cozy, friendly relationship being built between Kim and Trump. And then underneath, you have this very combative, even sometimes bitter negotiation between Mike Pompeo and his counterpart on the issue of denuclearization. And you saw that in stark terms, even as an American diplomat was handing the letter to the North Koreans in Singapore to deliver to Kim. Another North Korean official was lambasting the United States and Mike Pompeo for their bad attitude in the negotiations. And so what you see, and I think it's deliberate on the part of the North Koreans, is an effort in a way to drive a wedge between the president and his own negotiators. Kim thinks that President Trump is sincere and well-meaning and well-intentioned and wants to have a good relationship, but those pesky diplomats keep demanding that North Korea do all these things to denuclearize. It's a pretty effective strategy. It puts Mike Pompeo in a very bad spot because he's the guy who has to deliver this deal. And he's been very forthright about saying he sees a long, difficult negotiation ahead of the United States and North Korea.
And he acknowledged, he said, the timeline is going to be up to Chairman Kim. Thus far, no denuclearization that we have seen at the moment. We're going to take a quick break here, and we have so much more to talk about, so stay with us.